Hi everybody, I'm Marcie Zaharee. I'm an information systems engineer at the MITRE Corporation. MITRE is a federally funded research and development center. We actually own 6 FFRDCs, about 7,000 people, about 60 locations. My presentation today is going to be about the lessons learned that I'm going to be sharing with you on a 2-year taxonomy development effort that we had done for one of our sponsors, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, known as NGA. Last year, my presentation was on a 9-step framework for developing taxonomies. So I'm going to just do one slide this time in terms of a recap, and then focus in on the lessons learned, 3 lessons learned in working with teams, 3 lessons learned in working with SMEs, and 6 lessons learned in developing, maintaining, exporting, and posting our taxonomies. 2 years ago, our customer came to us and said, "Can you develop an unclassified intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance taxonomy using open source information, using open source taxonomy management tools? Can you create that taxonomy in a form that the framework is repeatable, that humans can understand, that systems can understand, and to be used to populate metadata?" Well, of course, we said. And off I went to Taxonomy Boot Camp 101. And the people I met there, Alice was the first friendly face I saw walking in the door when she told me about Z3919 and this handy-dandy little tool called Data Harmony Thesaurus Master. Then I went to Margie's Taxonomy 101 class to learn the difference between taxidermy and taxonomy, because that's the level that I was at. And I met with many people at that conference and learned from them in terms of, and I imagine many of you were there as well, I learned from all of you in terms of the best way to create a taxonomy. So I'm going to briefly go over the framework that I used. It was evolving all the time over the 2 years, and then jump right into the oopses, the challenges, the lessons learned that we faced. The most important thing for starting it is have a scope. You put 10 taxonomists in the room, you're going to come up with 10 different ways to classify information. For us, the scope was very narrow. We needed to have a taxonomy that captured instances of and categorizations of sensors and platforms that collected intelligence information. It doesn't mean sensors and platforms that move people around or transport goods, specifically sensors and platforms to collect intelligence information. Very important, because that it really helps you understand the scope of the effort. The second part is, where do I find the open source materials for this? We ended up with a combination. We used our MITRE enterprise licenses such as Janes and Periscope. We searched the web for military documents such as roadmaps and fact files, and we also used vendor files, because all vendors want to tell you about all the things that they do, and they always have a nice little website to glean information from. Once we have the sources, we had to gather the terms, parsing through everything manually to try and find an instance of a sensor, an instance of a platform, and try and make sense of it all. Once we had an Excel spreadsheet pretty much from A to Z on sensors and platforms, we had to try and categorize these in a taxonomy format. What's the broad term? What's the narrow term? What's the preferred term? What's the non-preferred term? Do we have scope notes? Being able to organize this into a manner that we all would recognize. What was really helpful for us, we have the poor man's version of Data Harmony, single user desktop, but the enterprise license has a visualization tool. That doesn't exist on the standalone one. So manually, we used an open source platform, Xmind, and we typed in sensor instances and the categorization. So we can see a linear list of the words and then the visualization. It really helps, and I'll talk about this later, how helpful this was in working with SMEs. And then at this point, when you've got an Excel file of 200 to 500 lines, you can't manage it very well. And this is where we needed to find a tool, and we used Data Harmony Thesaurus Master. Not only helped us organize it, but it has a very nice graphical user interface, and it helps export the terms. And that was something that was really helpful, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Throughout this whole process, we needed to be able to have SMEs to verify the content and the categorization of the taxonomies. We had two reports. One was a human readable report back to our sponsor, so you can see very nicely in 7 tabs in an Excel sheet the instances of sensors and platforms, how they're organized, and describing them. The other thing we had to do was have a machine readable language, because it's nice to have an Excel sheet, but you can't do anything with that other than read it. And once we converted these, again, Data Harmony was a nice tool for this because you have the OWL, the XML, and the SCOS outputs. And once we had that, we were able to post and share with communities of interest. Our sponsor asked us to use what used to be called the DoD Metadata Registry, which is now called the Data Services Environment. So when I say the word DSE, that's what it means. It's just a registry. This was the big picture framework. We developed this over time. It evolved, and there are some, although it's a framework and it worked well for us, it's not without limitations. And that's where I'm going to go to next, is talk to you about some of our lessons learned. But before I do that, I realize this is an awful lot of information. Last year this was 45 minutes, and now I've done this in 5 minutes. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any questions if you had them so far. And if you're just so intrigued you want me to go on, I can do that too.
Yeah.
Good?
How big was
Yes.
the thesaurus that you finally made? How many terms?
So we had actually, hold that thought. So glad you asked. So what did we do? We developed 13 taxonomies. 12 of them were sensors and platforms, and there was another one that was for processing, exploitation, and dissemination of intelligence information. But the 12 of them were sensors and platforms. They were small. They were single, standalone ones. We wanted to do a Lego approach, and when you tallied them all up, there was about 2,000 terms. So you're talking a very small taxonomy, not an enterprise-wide. This was a project level. We developed them. We used them. So in-house, we did a proof of concept for, you also using Lucene, and we were able to index 50,000 records with the taxonomy terms as the metadata, and then we created a search engine, and I'll show you a snippet of that later on, and to be able to show a taxonomy, and you can pick from a taxonomy to help you search for the data that you're looking for. So we developed it, we used it, we shared these taxonomies with the metadata registry, and we learned a great deal. So I'm going to go into those, what we learned. 3 lessons learned in working with teams. Educate team members. When we started this effort, it was just me and my head and my desktop, and I was just fine until I got help. And when other people came on the team part-time, what I found is everyone wants to do things their own way. So I, right up front, had to realize I had to document the concept of operations, a PowerPoint presentation, walking people through what we're doing, and having common templates. So the whole team was doing it the same way. And Sharon's actually going to talk about education in terms of JSTORs and what they have also done in this area as well. Consensus, as opposed to unanimous decision in a team. There was 5 of us part-time. I came from a knowledge management background. We had a systems engineer that was getting ready to retire. We had a remote sensing PhD person who used to write algorithms for sensors. We had a Navy signals SME, and we had a former Air Force fighter pilot. We were all coming at this in a different way, and had we just pretty much agreed to disagree a lot of times in terms of how we would categorize the taxonomy. There's a lot of early discussions. Do we have one large taxonomy? Do we have a separate sensor and platform taxonomy? Do we split it up into the domains for airborne, space, maritime, ground? A lot of ongoing discussion. And basically, we just couldn't ever really quite agree all of the time. And to make matters worse, we would meet 3 weeks later and not document the decision we had from the previous month. So then we have the same circular discussion all over again. So very important to document your decisions. So those are our 3 lessons learned and taught when working in teams. Moving on to SMEs. The good news is a network of experts is needed. The bad news is a network of experts is needed. I remember last year at Data Harmony, Gina had talked about how fickle and pompous SMEs can be. It is very true. They all come with their own passion and what they want you to add. And this was where we had a lot of differences of opinion. So we ended up having to establish guidelines for working with SMEs. Just like having education for team members, you need it for SMEs. They needed to understand the scope. For example, working with a space SME, we'd show them a listing of sensors and the big picture of what they would look like. And they would say, oh, but I want this facet. I have to know the orbit the satellite is flying in. Working with ground sensor SMEs, oh, I have to know the method of deployment. Did a plane fly over and drop it down? Is it a message in a bottle you throw in the ocean and hope it shows up somewhere? They need to have all these unique things. We had to make it very clear to them, we're not adding any more facets or categories. What we want from you is to look at the instances of the platforms and sensors and the categories that we picked. What are we missing? Can you give us more information? What was very helpful, as I talked about before, is having a graphical representation. You can't send a SME a 200 to 500 line Excel document and say, what did I miss? Because they're never going to get back to you. You have to sit down with them. This is a high touch, not high technology here. Sitting down with them and basically going over a big picture of what you're trying to do. Here's what my sensor taxonomy is going to look like, my platform taxonomy, some of the facets, and just to give you an idea of how much further this went, because this is extremely generic. If you can envision here on this side, what they would see would be on a platform, you can see I have air, ground, maritime, and space, manned and unmanned, and then there would be the listing of the individual sensors, individual platforms, the listing of the individual sensors. So they would see the instances and then the higher categorization, and that's what we were looking for feedback from them. But could not do it without a picture. So I've talked about teams and SMEs. Now actually developing the taxonomy, we ran across some challenges that we just could not get over, and aggregation of data was one. So I mentioned to you that our sponsor wanted us to put together an unclassified taxonomy using open source data. As you're parsing through data and documents, and you're picking out instances of sensors like little pieces of sand, it's all well and good until you start merging all the information about those sensors and platforms, what they collect, how they collect, who the manufacturer is. You create a totally separate animal in terms of the aggregation of the data. It shows a much bigger picture. We had a lot of challenges from the communities of interest that we worked with for measurement and signatures, for signals intelligence, for imagery intelligence, looking at these taxonomies and saying, I am not so sure that this is unclassified. Our argument back was, this was open source information. This was scouring the web, just like an adversary would do. Our data sources were unclassified. The other argument we would pose was, if you're working on classified information, you have a security classification guide that tells you what is classified, what is not, the relationships that are classified, capabilities, limitations. This was unclassified information. There was no security classification guide. And as a result, when we would post on the data services environment, even though you have to have a sponsor, a username, or password, we had to put many of our taxonomies yet behind another firewall, what they called the controlled unclassified environment. So people just couldn't get to them. We really weren't able to share as much as we wanted. And because there was no security classification guide, and since there was no one source of data, we had no authoritative source. The DoD directives talks about an authoritative source as a source that is a source of data that members of a community of interest recognize as valid or trusted because they're considered highly reliable or come from an official publication or reference. We didn't have that. So there was no one we could go to wave that magic wand to say, your taxonomies are unclassified. It was a challenge we couldn't get over that hurdle. Naming conventions. Two different things I want to talk to you about naming conventions. One is when I was working on my own computer, my file names and my folders, I knew where to find them all, just like a messy desk, you know where you put everything. When you start working with a team and you're passing files back and forth, or you're posting files to a shared drive, or you're doing that and then you're importing into Data Harmony, then you're exporting into Data Harmony, now you have a lot of file versions. And I made a lot of mistakes here trying to find, what did I call that and where did I put it? The second naming convention was actually working with the building the taxonomies, my preferred and the non-preferred terms. Let me give you an example. If I told you that there was an EH-60, would you know what that is? If I said if it was an EH-60 helicopter, but if I would have said the Black Hawk, ding, 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 I know what that is. E8, an E8 fixed wing. How about joint stars? Ring a bell? How about the AN-ASD-12? How about the Shared Reconnaissance Pod Imaging Sensor? But if you were a sensor SME and I said we have the SHARP sensor, you'd know what that would be. Not that I know what it is. So that was difficult in terms of naming conventions for the preferred and non-preferred term. What do you pick? Do you pick the acronym that everybody uses? Do you pick the common name? For example, the U-2 aircraft, the common name is Dragon Lady. Or do you give it that Army-Navy designator from the Joint Electronics one, the one I told you about, the AN/ASD-12? What do you use? Very hard decision. And when we built the 12 taxonomies as separate taxonomies like a Lego, we weren't consistent across the board, and I don't know that we could have been. On the fixed wing, it's very common, F-15, F-16, F-22, a bomber. The UAV world, the unmanned world, is so new, and there's so many of them coming out of the woodwork that they go by the common terms, the Predator, the Reaper, that you hear about in the news. So what we would do for fixed wing, preferred, non-preferred, is we would do something different for the unmanned. So we had some challenges here. Using Excel is nice for a human to read, as I mentioned earlier, but to be able to use the taxonomy, we really needed to have it in a machine ingestible language. And as I mentioned earlier, Data Harmony and Margie has mentioned as well, they have a lot of exports to be able to use. Once we had exported our 12 taxonomies and getting ready to go to the data services environment and post them all, we realized, oh, the government is eons behind industry. While OWL and SCOS were common in industry, the data service environment only would allow you to post OWL Lite. Now, I don't work in this space too much, but what I can tell you with the team that I worked with, there was a huge conversion between OWL and OWL Lite. And it's my understanding that as we tried to post them, in terms of the classes and the subclasses, and when we would post them to the data services environment, we would lose our non-preferred terms. We would lose our scope notes. So the important part of the taxonomies, we would lose when we posted. So know, if you're going to post to a registry, know what those posting requirements are. 2 years later, we're looking at the taxonomies saying, our concept of operations said we're going to update these on a yearly basis. We need to update. And then we're realizing that maintaining these terms in the 12 different taxonomies is tough, very challenging. Should we have all put them together into one? Don't know. With all of the changes in sensors in terms of especially the unmanned sensor space, they change so much. Keeping up with what's out there, keeping up with what is actually being used versus what's tested, it just became to be an ROI that we just could not. We just could not put the value and relevance here to continue to maintain it. So actually, last week we actually stopped this work effort, and it is complete. So I will not be here next year to tell you all the other things that we've done. So I've walked you through the lessons learned from teams, lessons learned from working with SMEs, or lessons learned from actually developing the taxonomy. And the last thing I want to leave you with before my summary slide is the user feedback. Human readable and machine ingestible. Human readable We put them on the data services environment, and the first few, before we had to hide them behind that controlled and classified environment, we had 600 downloads for the unmanned air vehicle taxonomy. Considering the fact that you even have to have a sponsor to get in there, a username and password that you have to change every 30 days, the fact that we had that many downloads, to me, says that people are interested in these taxonomies. So that's very nice to know. The other is we did get emails from people who had downloaded them asking about, why did you do it that way? Well, let me tell you, there's a scope. And then they would share with us how they were using it, and that was really nice to be able to get that feedback. The other set of feedback that I never, ever would have even envisioned until we tried to do a proof of concept inside MITRE and with our small team was that from the developers that were putting together the Lucene search engine. So two things I want to tell you. So here is a very small screenshot so you can see the drop downs of the taxonomies. For example, you have an option of geophysical, signals, and imaging. I'm just going to follow this white line here. The next level down, you can see they have a radar option. Following this over, we have a moving target indicator and then a specific sensor, the ANDPYN, of course, that everybody knows. And what you'll see is two things. One is, see all these underscores? That happened between a conversion between OW and OUT light. Could not get rid of it. Nobody searches that way. Nobody searches for synthetic, let me put that underscore in, aperture underscore. It doesn't happen. The other thing is that I never would have thought of this, the lengths of the terms, the preferred and the non-preferred terms. From a graphical user interface, it doesn't work. Light detection and ranging, we probably should have just used LiDAR. Synthetic aperture radar, we should have used SAR. Moving target indicator, MTI. Hyperspectral imagery, HSI. The non-preferred terms, look at this one. They're too long when it comes to trying to ingest them and use them. So this was a real big takeaway as we worked with our developers. Bringing this all back together, 2 years ago we were challenged with, can you build an unclassified taxonomy for ISR? Can you use open source? Can you do a repeatable framework? Can you share it, humans and machines? Can you use it to populate metadata? This was all a proof of concept. I do think we were very, very successful. We developed that 9-step framework I was sharing with you earlier, but all frameworks, they work well, but they're not without limitations. So today I wanted to share with you the lessons learned and the challenges we had with using this framework, because I know all of you are in some form working on taxonomies, either just starting or in the middle or maintaining them, and I wanted to be able to share these with you in the event that you can capture these challenges before they become an issue. Any questions? Yes?
So why wouldn't you listen to your SMEs in terms of adding additional facets or additional insights into your taxonomy?
After a while, it became too big. It just became
those are the
too
people
big.
who are going to be using, you're making that taxonomy for, right?
The taxonomy was actually going to be used it originally was going to be used as a controlled vocabulary to be used from metadata. And then it just kind of grew in terms of, well, let's see if we can, like Margie was saying, what's the card in your thing? Got a taxonomy, now what? And then we tried to implement it with search. And a lot of it too, if I had to tailor all the taxonomies for something unique that every SME would want, I think I would just lose scope from the beginning of what I wanted it for. It's a fine line. That's a hard one. Any others? Yes.
So you say this is a proof of concept.
Yes.
Was there an intention that it would ever be really used for some practical purpose? And if so, you also said that maintenance is complex, but the project is done. So is there any maintenance going on? Was there a plan?
So a good question. And so when I say proof of concept, I'm using that term in an intentional way, because MITRE, as an FFRDC nonprofit, we cannot build, we're not supposed to prototype, we can't compete with industry. So something that industry is doing, we shouldn't be doing. So we were asked to look at this as a proof of concept, and once we built them and then the maintenance stage, it's really should no longer be MITRE work. We showed the proof of concept. We wrote our MITRE technical report on what worked well, what didn't work well, and then passing that over to our sponsor at NGA to use in another way, as well as posting it on the communities of interest on the metadata registry so other people can use it. Did that answer your question?
Well, so nobody's formally maintaining it right now.
That is correct. Other questions? Yes.
Marcie, I don't know if this one's specifically for you, but your presentation spurred a question. We talk about SMEs.
Yep.
Is it dangerous to think of them all as SMEs? Or is it, did you notice differences depending? Like, his question made me think, like, well, maybe his SMEs are different than your SMEs, but aren't SMEs different depending on is their behavior different depending on the subject matter expertise?
I think their behavior is probably the same, but I'm going to let Margie answer this one. But we had SMEs within the company, and then we also needed a SME to represent the various domains. You know, you can't be a SME in something this big in terms of all of the sensors, be it ground, space, maritime, or air. So we know we had to bring in SMEs as communities of interest to represent those domains. But you have a lot of experience working with SMEs if you want to jump in.
Yeah, so when we constantly change our methodology for working with them because it depends on the kind of background that they have. Some of them are investigative scientists, and some of them are the high-made colonel type guys, and there's a little bit difference in their demeanor. And so it really does depend on the topical area that you're working on to some extent. But the lessons learned that she has for working with SMEs, particularly the training them, setting out what you want them to do, and giving them firm expectations is really important. So we have found, actually, for the primarily uninitiated, we need to tell them what we want them to get to us, what's the work module that they need to return. And then for the ones that live here in Albuquerque, or even ones that we talk to on the telephone, we try to do a 1 to 2 hour interview, and then we implement the changes. Because asking them to implement the changes using the tool was a non-starter. And same thing in spreadsheets and such. Like, if we want them to review it, we just need to give them a real clear idea of what they're looking, what we are asking them for. So Jack just did an interview last week with an SME on a technical scientific topic, and having talked with the guy for a couple hours, then he spent his 8 hours implementing the changes.
So I could go on at length about SMEs, which I won't, but I was going to say there's a difference between stakeholder SMEs and outside expert SMEs.
Yep, good point.
There's SMEs who are going to be, as Arthur said, involved, like a scientist who works for an organization that the taxonomy is designed for. They are writing or curating the content that the taxonomy will be applied to, are going to have a different perspective than just the guy who's an expert in the field. He's not from the organization. He's not going to be curating the content the taxonomy indexes. He's just an expert in the field. And those are different kinds of relationships to work with. And then I think the second thing is, as Margie said, you take the SME's input and then you digest it through your taxonomy expert filter. And so I would say an average of 60 or 70% maybe of what a SME suggests is implemented. It's never 100.
Yeah, another example I have with that is before I got into taxonomies, I was actually did training management for 10 years, and when we started to develop computer-based trainings for command and control systems for the Air Force, we would bring in SMEs from the various Air Force bases. So they were used to using legacy equipment a certain way. We're creating this new command and control system that they're going to be using a different way, and each one of them brought something very unique to their squadron or their force level application and how they use that legacy system. I can't make everything unique. What I can do is look across the board to see what is that commonality, what's that 80-20 rule, and then bring that in to make the appropriate change.
Another point that Marcie brought up that I'd like to emphasize
Certainly.
is at some point somebody has to say, that's it.
Yes.
We're doing it
Oh,
this way.
yes.
So
Yes.
even on the projects that we create here, we have a lot of differences of opinions among the team. So on every taxonomy we produce, somebody is the lead taxonomist, and their say is the final say. So if you had Gabe or Jack, for example, as your taxonomist, at the end of the day, if they're the team lead, they say, that's it, this is gonna be the term, I decided, end of story. Because otherwise they will argue, as Tim was saying yesterday, you can argue endlessly about terms, and somebody needs to have the power to make that decision to make it stick. Arthur?
So again, why did you go with so many different taxonomies? It didn't seem to sound as if your lexicon, whatever you call it, was that large. I mean, why
So,
did you need the dozen
okay,
separate taxonomies?
because they were by, I probably didn't explain that. They were by domain. So we had a sensor taxonomy, separate ones, one for air, one sensor taxonomy for ground, one sensor taxonomy for space, and one for maritime. We had separate taxonomies for platform air, platform ground, platform maritime, and that makes 8. What
Are
about,
they all
oh.
independent terms?
Well, actually, great question. The Lego approach, what we were going to do was try and build them separately and then pull them together and be able to relate them. Being able to say that the, grabbing things out of thin air here, Joint Stars has an MTI sensor. So in data harmony, we wanted to be able to merge them together and make the relationship. But we were afraid to do that right from the beginning. We wanted to do them singly so we can roll them up into a larger one. Good question.
In the long run, she could merge them. She could make them all into branches.
But it was easier to start off with separate.
Yes, because it was a proof of concept. Like I said, I didn't know what I was doing in the beginning. And I didn't want this big thing that I had to fix. I could fix little things.